He knew the exact vibration of a lie. Victor felt the tremble in the floorboards, the erratic pulse of a traitor's throat under his boot. Silence was his armour, cold and absolute. Until the new maid reached into her apron and dragged him into the agonizing, chaotic world of sound. Victor Costello did not rule his city with words. He ruled it with his eyes and with the soles of his shoes. The basement of the packing plant smelled of old iron, damp concrete, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. Victor stood perfectly still. To his right, his enforcer, Thomas, was holding a crowbar. On his knees in the centre of the room was a man named Leo, an underboss who had been skimming off the docks. Victor watched Leo's mouth. The lips formed rapid, wet shapes. The jaw snapped open and shut. Please. That was an easy word to catch. The bilabial plosive of the P, the teeth sinking into the lower lip for the S. The rest of it was a frantic blur of excuses. Victor didn't care about the words. Words were cheap. Words were a currency hearing people used to distract each other from the truth. Victor looked at the sweat gathering in the deep lines of Leo's forehead. He watched the rapid, bird-like flutter of the vein on the side of his neck. He felt the dull, rhythmic thud of Leo's knees shifting on the concrete floor, the vibrations travelling through the soles of Victor's handmade Italian Oxfords. The rhythm was erratic, panicked, guilty. Victor raised a single finger. Thomas swung the crowbar. Victor didn't hear the impact. He felt the sharp, sudden shock wave hit the floorboards, a heavy bass thud that rattled his molars. Leo collapsed. The vibration ceased. The problem was solved. Victor turned and walked up the concrete stairs, his hand grazing the damp cinder-block wall to steady himself. The vibrations of the heavy machinery above ground hummed against his palm. It was a familiar, comforting rhythm. The world, when you stripped away the noise, was just a series of shifting pressures and textures. When he returned to his estate in the hills, the environment shifted. He had designed the house specifically for his survival. There were no thick Persian rugs, no soundproofing foam. Every floor was polished oak or cold marble. Every footstep in the house registered as a tiny tremor in the floorboards. He knew his staff by their seismic signatures. The chef, a heavy man with bad knees, dragged his left heel. Thud scuff, thud scuff. The head of security, David, walked on the balls of his feet. Quick, tight, military precision. Victor took off his coat, tossing it over the back of a leather armchair. The leather squeaked against the fabric of his suit. He could feel the friction in his fingertips. He poured himself 2 fingers of scotch. The heavy crystal decanter clinked against the glass. He felt the sharp vibration of glass on glass. He drank. The liquor burned a slow, hot path down his throat. Then he felt it. A new rhythm. It came from the hallway leading to his private study. It wasn't the heavy drag of the chef, nor the sharp clip of David. It was methodical, slow, deliberate. A pause, then a soft scrape. A pause, then a soft scrape. Victor set his glass down. He moved to the doorway, his steps light, absorbing his own weight so he made no vibration at all. He peered into the hall. A woman was on her knees, scrubbing the baseboards. She wore the standard grey uniform of the estate staff, but it fit her poorly, bagging at the shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy knot. He watched her hands. They weren't the soft, manicured hands of the girls his mother used to hire. They were red at the knuckles, calloused. She moved the sponge with a mechanical, punishing rhythm. Suddenly, a heavy oak door slammed shut at the far end of the hall. The vibration was massive. A gust of wind had caught it. Victor felt the heavy jolt in his shins. He kept his eyes on the new maid. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She just kept scrubbing. Victor frowned. A sudden massive pressure change like that, a slam that rattled the floor, usually made people jump. It was an involuntary, startled response. Even the hardened killers in his syndicate twitched when a door slammed unexpectedly. But this woman simply shifted her weight, dipped her sponge into the bucket of cloudy, lemon-scented water, and wrung it out. He stepped out into the hallway, letting his heels strike the wood with deliberate force. Thud. She stopped. She didn't whip her head around. She slowly sat back on her heels and looked over her shoulder. Her eyes were a washed-out pale blue. They were tired. Dead tired. They held no reverence, no fear. She looked at him the way one looks at a heavy piece of furniture blocking a hallway. Victor pointed to the bucket, then to the end of the hall. Leave. She stared at his hand, then up at his face. Her lips barely moved, but he caught the shape of the word. Fine. She didn't scramble. She didn't bow. She wiped her hands on her coarse apron, picked up the heavy plastic bucket, and walked away. Her spine was perfectly straight. Victor watched her go. The scent of cheap lemon ammonia lingered in the air, masking the usual smell of beeswax and old paper. He reached up and rubbed the thick, knotted scar behind his right ear. It was a nervous habit. The scar tissue was numb, but the bone beneath it ached when it rained, or when he was confused. He walked into his study and picked up a pen, writing a single name on a notepad for David to investigate. The new girl. Find out where she came from. 2 weeks passed. The new maid's name was Abigail. According to David's background check, she was 28. No criminal record, previous employment at a series of mid-level hotels in the Midwest. A ghost. A nobody. But Victor didn't believe in nobodies. In his world, a blank slate was just a chalkboard that had been meticulously scrubbed clean. He began to watch her. It became an itch he couldn't scratch, a quiet obsession born of paranoia. He was a man who survived by reading the microscopic details of human behaviour, and Abigail was an anomaly. He noticed the contradictions. She was clumsy with delicate things. He watched from the terrace as she dropped a stack of porcelain saucers in the kitchen. He felt the chaotic, jagged vibrations of the plates shattering on the tile. Yet, when she polished his antique grandfather clock, her fingers moved with the delicate, terrifying precision of a bomb technician. She smelled like cheap diner coffee and rain. No perfume, no scented lotions, just bitter earth and ozone. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study was the colour of bruised iron. A storm was rolling in off the coast. Victor could feel the change in barometric pressure. It made the old, dead metal buried deep in his mastoid bone throb with a dull, sickening ache. He was sitting at his desk, going through shipping manifests. Abigail was in the room, dusting the bookshelves. He had allowed her to clean the study, a privilege usually reserved for his oldest, most trusted housekeeper. He wanted her close. He wanted to see her crack. He watched her reflection in the glass of his liquor cabinet. She was reaching up to dust the top shelf. Her apron tightened across her waist. He saw the outline of something heavy in the right pocket. It wasn't a phone. It was too thick, too blocky. Victor picked up a solid brass paperweight from his desk. It weighed 3 pounds. He held it over the edge of the desk. He waited until she was precariously balanced on her toes, reaching for a high corner. He dropped the brass. It hit the hardwood floor with a violent concussive vibration. It was the kind of impact that mimics a gunshot to the deaf. Abigail's reaction was instantaneous, but it was entirely wrong. She didn't scream or cover her head. She didn't jump. Instead, her entire body tightened, dropping low to the ground in a fluid defensive crouch. Her right hand flew to the heavy object in her apron pocket. Her pale blue eyes scanned the room, locking onto the brass paperweight rolling across the floor and then slowly sliding up to meet Victor's gaze. She realized what he had done. Victor sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the desk. He held her stare. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. Not the frantic hyperventilation of a startled maid, the measured breathing of someone bringing their adrenaline under control. She slowly stood up. She released the object in her pocket. She walked over, picked up the heavy brass paperweight, and set it back on his desk. The metal was warm from her hand. She looked at him. Her lips moved. He read the words. "You're an asshole." Victor froze. Nobody spoke to him like that. Not his underbosses, not his rivals. They cowered. They spoke in flowery, respectful tones. But this woman, with her chapped lips and smelling of dust, had just insulted the head of the Costello family to his face. He felt a strange, tight sensation in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as amusement. He leaned forward, tapping his index finger on the wood of the desk. He pointed at her pocket. She shook her head. Her face was a mask of stone. She turned her back on him and went back to the bookshelves. The ache in Victor's skull sharpened. He had been born into a world of absolute silence. No muffles, no low hums, just a void. When he was 10, his father, a brutal man who viewed his son's deafness as a humiliating defect, had dragged him to a clandestine clinic in Geneva. The doctors promised a miracle, an experimental bone conduction implant surgically embedded directly into the skull, designed to bypass the ear canal entirely. The surgery was a butcher's job. The clinic was raided by a rival family while Victor was still under anesthesia. His father was killed. Victor survived, but the external transmitter, the piece required to actually make the implant work, was lost in the chaos. The doctors were dead. The blueprints burned. For 20 years, Victor had carried a useless dead piece of titanium and copper wired into his bone. A tombstone in his head. He watched Abigail dust. He watched the way she lingered near the safe behind the painting. She didn't try to open it. She just traced the edges of the frame. She wasn't a cop. Cops were arrogant. They took up space. She wasn't a rival assassin. An assassin would have killed him while he was distracted by the ledgers. She was looking for something. Victor decided he was going to let her find it. The storm broke at midnight. Victor was in his bedroom, standing by the window. The sky fractured with jagged lines of white lightning. He couldn't hear the thunder, but he felt the heavy rhythmic concussions rattling the glass panes against his fingertips. It was a violent, angry night. He had sent the security detail to the perimeter. The house was empty save for him and the skeleton staff in the east wing. He felt a vibration. It wasn't the thunder. It was inside the house. It was faint, muffled by the distance, but his feet recognized the signature. Slow, deliberate. A pause, a soft scrape. Abigail. She was in the west wing, his father's old wing, a place that was strictly forbidden. Victor opened the nightstand drawer. The cold, heavy steel of the 1911 pistol felt familiar in his grip. The checkering on the handle dug into his palm. He slid the magazine in, feeling the solid, satisfying click of the metal seating into place. He chambered around. The vibration of the slide, racking back and snapping forward, travelled up his forearm. He stepped out of his bedroom into the dark hallway. He walked barefoot. The wood was cold against his soles. He moved like a ghost, absorbing his weight, leaving no seismic footprint. He followed the faint vibrations. They led to the library at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. A sliver of pale yellow light spilled onto the floorboards. Victor approached, raising the pistol. His thumb rested on the safety. He smelled old leather, decaying paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the storm outside. And underneath it all, the faint, bitter scent of diner coffee. He nudged the door open with his shoulder. Abigail was standing at his father's massive mahogany desk. She had bypassed the modern safe entirely. Instead, she had pulled out the bottom drawer of the desk and was running her hands over the wooden panelling beneath it. Victor watched her fingers find a hidden latch. A small dry crack reverberated through the floor as a false bottom popped open. She reached inside. Victor stepped into the room. He didn't bother hiding his footsteps now. He let his heel drop heavily. Thud. Abigail froze. She didn't gasp. She slowly withdrew her hand from the hidden compartment. She kept her back to him. Victor raised the gun, aiming dead center at her spine. He waited. She slowly turned around. The pale light from the small desk lamp cast deep, hollow shadows under her eyes. She looked exhausted. The tension in her shoulders wasn't fear. It was the heavy, sagging weight of a long journey coming to an end. Victor gestured with the barrel of the gun. "Show me." Abigail didn't raise her hands in surrender. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him, her pale eyes dropping to the ugly puckered scar behind his right ear. She brought her hands forward. In her right hand she held an object. Victor narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of it in the dim light. It was a block of tarnished metal, about the size of a cigarette pack. It was cracked down the centre, held together by frayed electrical tape. Coils of green, oxidized copper wire spilled out from one side. On the top was a small rusted dial and a short, thick antenna. It looked like garbage, a piece of obsolete junk. Victor's brow furrowed. He tightened his grip on the gun, confused. This is what she had infiltrated his house for. This is what she had risked her life to steal. Abigail looked down at the device in her hand. She rubbed her thumb over the rusted dial. Her lips moved. "I'm sorry." Victor read the words, his confusion turning into cold anger. He stepped forward, ready to strike her, ready to end this bizarre charade. Abigail twisted the dial. A green light, weak and flickering, snapped on. And then reality tore open. It didn't happen in the room. It happened inside Victor's skull. A violent electric shock lanced through the scar tissue behind his ear. It was a physical blow, a spike of pure, white-hot agony driven straight into his brain. Victor gasped, his eyes going wide. He stumbled backward, his bare foot slipping on the polished wood. The silence, the deep, comfortable, protective ocean of silence he had lived in for 30 years, shattered. It was replaced by a screeching, tearing sensation. It wasn't just a feeling. It was intrusive. It was inside his head, bouncing off his skull, high-pitched, chaotic, and unimaginably loud. Static. A roaring, scraping, hissing tsunami of sensory input. His knees buckled. The 1911 slipped from his nerveless fingers, hitting the floor. He clutched the sides of his head, his fingernails digging into his scalp. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sensation that flooded his brain overpowered his own voice. Through the blinding, nauseating roar of static in his head, the frequency shifted. The screeching dialed down, morphing into a heavy rhythmic rumbling. Boom! 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 It took his brain seconds to process the input, to connect the new, terrifying sensation to the physical world. He was seeing the lightning flash outside the window. A second later, the rumble tore through his skull. Thunder. He was experiencing thunder. The sheer volume of the world was a physical weight crushing him. The hum of the desk lamp, the wet, ragged sound of his own desperate breathing, the rustle of fabric. He fell to his side, curling into a fetal position, vomiting pure bile onto the expensive hardwood floor. The smell of stomach acid mixed with the ozone. The world was spinning, a chaotic carousel of noise. He looked up through tear-blurred eyes. Abigail was standing over him. She had dropped the device. It lay on the floor between them, humming a low electric frequency that vibrated directly into Victor's jawbone. She was looking down at him. Her face was twisted in a mixture of horror and profound sorrow. She knelt beside him. She reached out, her calloused hand hovering over his shoulder. Her lips moved. But this time, Victor didn't have to read them. Through the crackling, agonizing static pouring into his revived implant, a voice, soft, raspy, and terribly clear, echoed directly inside his head. "I didn't want to turn it on," she whispered, the sound vibrating through his bones. "But they're coming to finish what they started in Geneva, and you have to hear them to survive." Victor stared at her, the world fading to black as his brain, overloaded by a lifetime of hoarded sound rushing in all at once, finally shut down. Coming back to consciousness was not a gentle surfacing. It was a violent exhumation. The first thing Victor registered was a mechanical grinding roar that seemed to tear at the inside of his skull. It was rhythmic. Whir, click, whir, click. He threw his arm over his face, expecting to find heavy machinery hovering inches above his nose. There was nothing. Just the ceiling of the library. He realized, with a sickening jolt of nausea, that he was hearing the ceiling fan. The small brass motor, spinning lazily above, sounded like a diesel engine. He groaned. The sound vibrated in his chest, but it also erupted in his head. A wet, guttural, scraping noise that terrified him. It was his own voice. He clamped his hands over his ears. It did nothing. The noise wasn't coming through his ears. It was being injected directly into his jaw, through the bone, bypassing his ear canals entirely. "Don't fight it." The voice was static-laced, carrying a metallic buzz. Victor wrenched his eyes open. Abigail was kneeling beside him. She had a roll of silver duct tape in her teeth. She ripped a piece off. The tearing sound was excruciatingly sharp, like a razor blade slicing down his spine. He lashed out, his hand wrapping around her throat, pinning her against the base of the heavy mahogany desk. His breathing was jagged, loud, a horrifying raspy wheeze that filled the room. He wanted to demand answers, but he didn't know how loud he was speaking. He had never needed to regulate his volume before. "Turn it off," he gritted out. To his own brain, the word sounded monstrous, disjointed. Abigail didn't choke. She didn't pry at his fingers. She just stared at him with those washed-out blue eyes. "I can't," she wheezed. "It's fused. The dial broke when I dropped it. It's stuck on." Victor felt a spike of pure panic. He reached for the back of his head, his fingers scrabbling for the device. Abigail grabbed his wrist. Her grip was startlingly strong. "My father built this," she said rapidly, the words bleeding into a rush of syllables. "Geneva, 20 years ago. He was the engineer. The Moretti family killed him after they shot your father. They wanted the tech. They wanted to sell it to the military. He hid the transmitter. I've spent 10 years tracking it down and another 5 finding you." Victor stared at her. The name Moretti tasted like ash. "Why bring it to me?" Victor forced the words out, trying to control the grotesque wet sounds of his own mouth. "Why ruin my silence?" "Because they found out I had it, and they know you're alive." She looked away, her jaw tight. "And because I watched them slaughter my dad while I hid in a cabinet. I want the Morettis dead. You're the only one with enough power to do it, but you can't fight them if you can't hear them coming." Suddenly, a sharp, incredibly loud crack split the air. Victor flinched violently, his entire body seizing. The sound was distinct from the thunder outside. It was hard, metallic, and it lacked the lingering rumble of the storm. "Silenced rifle," Abigail whispered, her face draining of colour. "Outside. They're taking out your perimeter guards." Victor released her throat. His hands were shaking. He was the head of a syndicate. He had ordered dozens of men to their graves. He had watched bones break and flesh tear without a change in his pulse. But this assault on his senses, rendered him weak, fragile. He pressed his back against the desk. He closed his eyes, trying to isolate the data. For 30 years he had survived by reading the physical world. He focused on his feet. The floorboards were cold. He felt the familiar deep thud of the storm. Then another sound. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. It was coming through the bone behind his ear. A dry, brittle noise. Someone walking on the gravel driveway beneath the library window. Victor scrambled for his 1911 pistol on the floor. His fingers closed around the checkered grip. The cold steel grounded him. "How many?" he asked, trying to pitch his voice low. It sounded like a loud, muddy growl in his own head. "I don't know," Abigail said. She reached into her apron and pulled out a heavy snub-nosed revolver, the object she had been hiding earlier. She checked the cylinder. The sharp, clicking rotation of the metal chambers made Victor wince. The front door, 2 hallways over, exploded. Victor felt the concussive wave hit his chest a fraction of a second before the deafening roar of the breaching charge tore through the transmitter in his skull. He screamed, dropping the gun to press the heels of his hands hard against his eyes. his brain overloaded by the sheer physical pressure of the noise. It was agony. Complete, blinding agony. Victor! Abigail was shaking his shoulder. He opened his eyes. The world was spinning. They're in the house. We have to move. Now? He forced himself up, his knees trembling. The silence was gone forever. The world was a screaming, jagged nightmare, and the monsters were already inside. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the intermittent strobing flashes of lightning. Victor moved down the corridor. Abigail tightened his back. Every step he took sounded like a hammer striking an anvil in his head. His heart was a frantic, wet drum. The smell of burning cordite from the front door drifted down the hall, sharp and acidic, mixing with the scent of ozone. He needed to adapt. He had to stop fighting the implant and start using it. He pressed his shoulder against the flocked wallpaper, feeling the texture through his shirt. He closed his eyes for 2 seconds, forcing his brain to categorize the auditory chaos. Hiss. The rain hitting the windows. Ignore it. Thump, thump. His own pulse. Ignore it. Squeak. Scrape. Rubber soles on the marble foyer. 3 men, moving fast, spreading out. He opened his eyes and signed to Abigail, an old habit. 3, moving left. She nodded, gripping her revolver with both hands. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of the dining room up ahead. Victor didn't wait to see the weapon. He raised the 1911 and fired twice. The noise of his own gun going off in the enclosed hallway was catastrophic. It didn't just hurt. It felt like a spike being driven through his right eye. He stumbled sideways, dropping to one knee, a high-pitched electronic squeal replacing the world as the cheap, decades-old transmitter struggled to process the decibel level. Through his blurred vision, he saw the shadow collapse, clutching a ruined chest. The heavy, wet slap of the body hitting the floor was grotesque. It wasn't the clean, silent death Victor was used to observing. It was loud, messy, and pathetic. Bullets chewed into the wall above Victor's head. Plaster rained down on his hair, pinging off the wood floor with a sound like broken glass. "Move!" Abigail yelled. She grabbed the collar of his shirt and dragged him into the adjacent parlour. Victor rolled behind a heavy leather sofa. His head was ringing, a constant, sickening whine that made his teeth ache. He spat onto the carpet, his mouth tasting of copper and bile. "You can't shoot," Abigail panted, reloading her revolver. "The muzzle blast in enclosed spaces. The implant can't handle it. It'll short out your nervous system." "Then how do I kill them?" Victor gasped, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Close the distance," she said. "Use the noise. Let them look for you." Victor looked at his hands. They were covered in plaster dust and sweat. He holstered the 1911. From a sheath on his belt, he drew a fixed blade hunting knife. The steel slid from the leather with a soft, deadly shh. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing the panic down into a tight, hard knot in his stomach. He was Victor Costello. He owned the dark. He crept toward the doorway leading to the adjoining conservatory. The floor in there was polished stone. He waited, listening. The electronic whine in his head slowly faded, replaced by the terrifying clarity of the immediate environment. Click. A magazine being seated into an assault rifle. Scuff. A boot pivoting. The man was standing just past the archway, waiting for Victor to peek out. Victor didn't peek. He felt the vibration of the man's weight on the stone floor, cross-referencing it with the faint, wet sound of the man breathing. He calculated the distance. Victor lunged. He rounded the corner low. The gunman fired a burst, but the bullet shattered the antique mirror behind where Victor had been a second before. Victor drove the knife upward, under the tactical vest, burying it to the hilt in the man's diaphragm. The sound was awful. A wet, tearing suction followed by a wet, bubbling gasp. The man collapsed, dragging Victor down with him. Victor twisted the blade, feeling the friction of the ribcage against the steel, hearing the horrifying gurgle of lungs filling with fluid. He pulled the knife free. The body went still. Footsteps rushed up behind him. Heavy. Rushed. Victor spun, but he was off balance. The third man was there. raising a shotgun. Before the man could pull the trigger, a deafening roar filled the room. Abigail stepped into the archway, her revolver kicking wildly in her hands. She shot the man twice in the side. He dropped the shotgun, screaming, a high, reedy sound of pure agony that grated on Victor's overloaded nerves and fell against a glass coffee table, shattering it. Victor scrambled forward and brought the heavy pommel of his knife down on the man's temple. The screaming stopped. The house fell quiet. Victor remained on his hands and knees, chest heaving. The silence wasn't real anymore. It was filled with a low electric hum from the implant, the steady drumming of rain, and the ragged, desperate breathing of the woman standing a few feet away. He looked down at his hands. They were soaked in blood. The smell of it, hot, metallic, and sickeningly sweet, filled his nose. He had killed dozens of men in his life, but for the first time, he felt the true, disgusting weight of it. Violence wasn't a silent, elegant chess move. It was loud, chaotic butchery. Abigail slowly lowered her gun. She walked over to him, her boots crunching on the broken glass. She knelt beside him, her apron stained with plaster and soot. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and pressed the palm of her hand against his cheek. Her skin was warm, rough. "It's over," she said. Her voice vibrated through his jaw. It wasn't a beautiful sound. It was exhausted, cracked, and human. Victor leaned into her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't want to hear his own voice again. The world he had known was dead, shattered by the crude, battered device wired to his skull. The protective void was gone. He closed his eyes, listening to the rain, the hum of the electricity, and the steady, imperfect beating of Abigail's heart. He hated it. He hated the noise. But as he felt her thumb brush a streak of blood from his cheek, he knew he would never go back to the silence. The silence was Victor's armor, but sound became his brutal reality. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the very things keeping us from the truth. What did you think of Victor's agonizing awakening? Would you have turned the transmitter on? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If this story kept you on edge, hit that like button, share it with fellow dark romance fans, and subscribe for more deeply human, raw storytelling.